start, we're going to talk about why is compensation negotiation important? And specifically, James, based on the data that you have from the pay index, could you walk us through why it's important, for compensation negotiation throughout an executive's career?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges on pay data is how to get hold of it. You can ask your friends, but that's quite awkward. You can look at various online tools such as the pay index. Some are more accurate than others. And because we have such a fast moving economy, or sorry, let me rephrase that. Because the economy is in an interesting time at the moment with high interest rates and high inflation rates, salaries are moving very, very quickly as well. So you want to make sure that you're being paid fairly. And what the pay index does is it offers you pay transparency. So you're able to get that data quickly and for free, as you have seen. There are several times when you're going to need this data. You don't need it all the time, obviously, but if you're going through your annual salary review, or if you are looking to change roles, or if you've been made redundant and you're looking for another role, this is when you need that data, so you're not going to be underpaid. So I think there are a number of reasons why this is important. And as you know, when we were discussing these charts earlier this week, just to, I guess, give you a little bit of information about what we're looking at here. So the top right chart is one based on total compensation. This is the pay index data set, literally from you starting your career through to 30 years plus experience. And you can see that it goes up and up and up, and then it sort of peaks at about 26 to 30 years experience, and then potentially it begins to flow off or begins to drop. Now, obviously, this is dependent upon which geography you live in and what sector you work in and the rest of it. But it's just worth bearing in mind where your peak earning power is, I guess. The bottom right graph is about how your compensation may vary through the tenure of your role. So this is measured in months at your current organization. You can see there's a bit of a kicker to start with. So quite often in different functions, you might find that people that are coming in that are newer than you may be paid higher than you because they're having to pay more because of market rates. So that's why there's a slight, that's why there might be a drop. And then you can see that your compensation goes up as you get more experience in that role, and then it might begin to drop off again. So it's just worth being wary of this sort of data. And as I say, if you're using the pay index, you can see what these charts look like on your particular profile, because I've given you some examples here, but obviously they vary from role to role.
Right. And just to clarify, some of the data that we're looking at here are really just a combination of different types of roles, right? It's not specific to a particular role or industry.
Yeah, absolutely, Colson. So these are examples. We've got a global data set. We have access to individuals from 160 different countries. We've got 2 APIs connected with exchange rate and cost of living data. So it's a pretty complete, well, there's no such thing as a complete data set, sorry. It's a pretty comprehensive data set, I guess is what I should be saying. Yeah. So I think there should be some data in there for everybody.
Yep. And, some of the questions, we're getting tons of questions from the audience, which is great. But, one of the questions is, who puts in the data that the pay index uses? And so
that's a very good question. So we take data sources from a variety of different profiles to make it as robust as possible. What we also do is, so what data you're looking at, we also disclose how many profiles you're comparing your own data against. So if we start off with thousands or tens of thousands of data points, that's great. But by the time you've narrowed down your sector, your function, your level, your years of experience, are you comparing yourself with 100 data points or 10 data points? And that's important that you understand that. When you register, the data that you put in is self-reported. So we're relying upon you to put your data in, and then you're comparing yourself against your peer group. So that's why it tends to be reasonably accurate. What is interesting is that we have data that flows over time as well. So if you imagine, Colson, we've got data that goes back through the years now where we have trend analysis, so we can see how salaries versus bonuses versus discretionary pay vary in different sectors. So it's really, really interesting.
Great. And another question is around, you kind of see that dip at the, 26, 30 plus mark. Is that typical to say that it's typically around the retirement timeframe for an executive when you look at the years of experience graph there?
Well, there's a commonality there, I guess. If you start the workforce when you're, say, early 20s, and then you do 30 years experience, that's going to take you to the early 50s. There are obviously people that take early retirement then. That's not typical for every career, but obviously in some it's going to be people will have an earlier retirement. So, I mean, I'm sure we've all got friends and family that have retired early, and lucky them. And they've got onto a role which is part-time, or maybe it's not. They might have gone into a plural career. So yeah, that's how you can see how it might happen.
Great. So just looking at the data that we have, I think, having a negotiation strategy is really important. And so Simeon, could you walk us through why it's important to have a strategy, used in combination with maybe some of the data that you get from the pay index?
Yeah, certainly, Colson. So negotiation for compensation is one of those elephants in the room where, when I'm working with some of our clients, right, at BlueSteps, we get into talking about career and kind of skills and capabilities and value proposition. And then we get to the point about, well, what happens when you're at the interview? And let's say the person likes you and you're thinking about, well, how do I broach the subject of compensation negotiation? It's something that necessarily needs to be addressed. And, one of the benefits of having the pay index is really it gives you a baseline, right? So as James has talked about, it gives you a starting point, right? What fair may look like depending on what part of the world you're living in. But I think also importantly to your point is that it is a strategy, because you can't go into an organization, you can't go into an interview with just sort of a haphazard number and say, well, I think 15% is worth more because that's the role that I had before, right? So number one is, determining what a fair salary to you is important and revealing exercise about a number of things, right? So when you compare yourself to the TPI, you might, first of all, be very surprised, right? That's the first reaction is, oh, I didn't know that you could make so much money, or I didn't know that it was so low paying when I go somewhere else, right? But that idea of kind of what's fair reveals a lot about kind of in that industry, how much they value what you have to offer, right? It's also very revealing about the company itself, right? So if you kind of talk to people, negotiation strategy, as James has said, you talk to some other people who have worked at the company, and they say, well, it's very rigid at the company. They don't really kind of, go beyond their bands. In looking at negotiation for compensation, you find out a lot about how they operate, right, from a culture perspective. So it's also important revealing, I tell my clients, from your own personal experience, right, which is we often kind of go into an environment, and a lot of clients do this, with a bit of a sense of entitlement, right? So I've been working at a certain place for 20 years, and now this is how much I make, and so therefore you should pay me this plus 10%, right? But it reveals kind of where it is that you should sort of maybe settle yourself in a little bit, a more fair kind of a band. Number two is that it forces you to do your homework, right? So one of the homeworks is TPI. Obviously, that's a very critical piece of it. But then it also kind of forces you to find out more about the job, about the company, about the market itself. I always tell very senior clients that there's 9 or 10 other resumes that are on the table. You do realize that you're not the only one with 20 years of CEO experience, right? And so you kind of look at the market and you say, well, what's sort of a fair comparison if you were to look at some of your peers or something like that? So you have to do your homework, right? A Harvard Business Review study, and James was talking about this earlier, people are a little shy to talk about how much they make. Well, they actually said that a quarter of respondents who were asked, would you reveal your compensation to a friend or someone if they asked you, a quarter of them said that they would. They would be very clear, and they'd probably, usually it's kind of attached to, it's not fair enough, they don't pay me enough, and this is how much I make. So, but I think it's important to do that, because you don't know unless you ask, right? And the homework that's behind that is, we don't put enough work behind that. We put a lot of work behind the career part of it, but we get to the negotiation of it, this is kind of what you deserve, right? We'll talk about that in a second. So number three is I always tell my clients that compensation is about earning and about deserving, right? So when you go into an argument, a conversation about, a serious conversation about negotiation, you can't go in there just saying, this is how much I deserve, right? Because this is what I've done. First of all, the company doesn't know that. That's a fact. It looks great on paper. Many people have, recommended you, but in some sense, you also have to think about, you're communicating to the recruiter, how is it that you're going to earn that salary, right? And you're going to say, well, in my mind, I know the cost of living from TPI is, X% higher. I think I can add value there because your market is very specific to financial services, whatever it is, and I can add value to that. That's how I earn my compensation, right? So especially when you're looking at a plus compensation, you're not negotiating down, right? So think about from the perspective of what you need to do to earn that versus kind of what you deserve in the sense of what you've done in the past, right? It's not that you're not talented. It's simply that you have to show how you're going to contribute to value to that company that you're joining. And there's many other reasons. I'm sure that you can all think about, when you've had to get to that point, why is it important to have a strategy, right, behind sort of the negotiation part? I'm just going to do a very silly plug from a quote that I had. And it's, own your story or else others will. And this is so true when in the number of clients that I work with where, whether it's sort of your skills and kind of communicating yourself, whether it's, talking about how much you want, you think that you should earn from a base plus salary from, benefits and all that. You have to own that. So you have to have a strategy that kind of puts you in place there so that otherwise people will just, it's the undercurrent, right, of the market. They're just going to pull you in and say, well, I'm just going to give you this much because you haven't thought about how much you're worth, right?
Yeah.
So that strategy is important, Kulsum.
So, do you think there's a difference between, if you're negotiating for a new role versus a promotion? Do these same kind of 4 items apply for both?
Yeah, these 4 items certainly apply for a new role, right? In a new company, perhaps even a new industry. And perhaps if you're going to a startup from a corporate large company, right? Something like that, because you're talking about value that you add that they don't know you from a fly on the wall, right?
Yeah.
In the same company, it's slightly different. And the reason for that is you've got sort of a reputation behind you, right? So if you've got a reputation that is a superstar, you've consistently superseded your sales quota, or you're heavily involved with a huge digital transformation, then obviously, you may not need to do as much homework about the market or about the competitors, but you certainly need to do some research around what your CEO is saying, right? About the top 5. Here's what the top 5 strategies are for the next 3 years. Well, you kind of need to attach your value to what the company is saying that their direction is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of homework that you need to do is internally what is important to the company is where you need to align yourself, right? And then the conversation is still the same, which is, this is why I'm uniquely qualified to help you solve that problem, right? So Mr. Ms. CEO, you've mentioned this thing. I think 3, 4, and 5 as strategies, here's where I can add value. And so, that's an important part of it, the research internally. But going back to the reputation, if you don't have a very good one, that kind of sets you back, right? And you may not even get an audience at the table. So, I'd say doing your homework is still the same. Conveying how you're going to earn that, how you're going to attach that if it's a new company versus the existing one is very important. But you just have to make sure that you know what you're talking about, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can I just add a comment there as well? I think what is important is, especially if you've got an intermediary involved, maybe there's a headhunter involved, especially if you're, obviously you wouldn't have a headhunter involved if it's within an organization, but if it's into a different organization, and even more so into a different sector or geography where maybe you're less familiar, you're not as familiar with the compensation levels, I think that's where it's even more important to do your homework. So that when you're liaising with the headhunter that will normally be acting as an intermediary with the host company, you have a better idea about what ground zero is, and you have an idea about, if I was to move from the US to South Africa, for instance, what's the cost of living like in South Africa? Where do you get that data from? How do you work out if I was to move to Johannesburg, how does that differ to Cape Town? Being better prepared, I think, will help you in your negotiation.
Great. And, I think on that point, saying, if you have an executive search consultant or somebody else you're working with in, negotiating the role, you might have a better understanding of maybe what your worth is. Do you have any other tips around what other tools, like aside from the pay index, that maybe a candidate could use to better understand their worth? Either Simeon or James?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the things that I always encourage my clients to do when we talk about sort of negotiations, compensation, is you need to understand kind of where the puck is going towards, right? You want to skate to where the puck is, as Wayne Gretzky would say. And so the point really is that you need to read and do your research around what's going to be important in the next 3 to 5 years, right? So the understanding of that, and then relating your own skill back to where that fits into that, will give off the idea, and you may have this already, a sense of vision, right? And so the other tips are just simply, you need to kind of understand what's being written about the market and be well versed in being able to kind of be a little bit more flexible as far as talking about talking points, right? And seem to be intelligent. I mean, I'm sure everybody here is intelligent, but so tips and tricks really are to keep your eyes open, do your homework. Don't sort of like, I'm too tired to read this thing. Over time, you accumulate knowledge that you don't even know you have until you're being asked that question. So make sure that you're in the game that way. The starting point, the TPI, is a great tool for the starting point. And then beyond that is sort of saying, well, how much is AI going to be worth, right? Talk a lot about blockchain, AI, all this stuff. If I think that it's going to be worth 20%, right, of my pay, then make sure you kind of start baselining towards that and saying, how can I hit that mark, right?